And welcome to Whiskey Politics. I'm Dave Sussman, your host and purveyor at whiskeypolitics.net. Great to be here at America's Voice News, 6 p.m. Eastern daily. You can also find us on YouTube. Just look for Whiskey Politics, hit that notification bell and subscribe button. And if you're listening in the car or on the trail, please don't forget to download Whiskey Politics on iTunes, Stitcher, GooglePlay, and the Ricochet Audio Network. So the big news this week, with all the big news this week, I think the biggest news this week, at least if you're watching the mainstream media, is Beto jumped into the presidential race. Beto. This is the... This is the guy who compares climate change crusaders to those who were on the beaches in Normandy. Oh, Lord. Okay, forget about what this guy says for a minute. He's cool. He's Beto. It's like this sound excited children make in commercials when they got their fruit roll-ups. It's Beto! I think I'm pronouncing it correct, right? It's Beto, Beta, I don't know. How about we call him by his real name? Robert O'Rourke, who has been elevated by the idol makers in Washington, D.C., who have instructed the media to worship this guy. And boy, are they doing so. You know, first they compared him to Reagan, but oh no, you can't compare a Democrat to Reagan. Got a lot of feedback on that one. So now they're comparing him to Obama. They've got the Annie Leibovitz pictures. He's on Vanity Fair. Oh, you know, but the thing is that this is a guy who Instagrammed himself with his mouth widened agape so you can see his lurch-sized chompers being cleaned or something at the dental office. He Instagrammed the video, like... And so narcissistic that he actually thought people wanted to see him sitting there with drool coming out of his suction pipe. Oh, this is where we are today in America. This is now going to be one of the leading candidates for one of the two major parties of president of the United States. And oh yeah, there's that whole DUI thing. I don't know if you've heard about this or not. You know, him leaving the scene of an accident after committing a driving under the influence, in addition to some arrest of some kind for stealing something. Now, this isn't right-wing website stuff that you would find out there. This is admitted to by the Beto campaign. So yeah, it was probably in the 70s, right, when he was a kid. No, it was probably in the 80s, right, when he was in high school or a young adult. Nope. Maybe in the early 90s. When he was finishing college? Nope. 1998, folks. 1998. This is 21 years ago. Now, we could stop a man from becoming Supreme Court Justice of the United States with no proof of something someone said about almost 40 years ago. A distant memory, may not been, maybe this and that. But we actually have history of a person breaking the law in recent history in the last couple of decades. So let's make him president. The media are gushing. Holy cow. They are slobbering over this guy. They are giddy. They are embarrassing themselves. And for what? What has he accomplished? Well, besides the very important task of taking a multicultural nickname, Beto, which is Spanish for Robert, or Roberto, I should say. He's Irish, by the way, just in case you didn't know. Irish. He stands, what does he stand for? Well, let's see. He stands for removing that important, I would say, border wall between El Paso and Juarez. I've been to El Paso, Texas, folks. I've crossed that bridge over the Rio Grande. I've walked into Juarez. Thought I wanted to get some authentic Mexican food. This is back in 2004 or 05. A lot of people in my life were very upset I did this because in Juarez, the Mexican cartels use severed human heads as soccer balls. He wants to remove the border. Okay, so we joke about Beto, but the very real threat about Beto is something that I think many on the right are dismissing. First of all, a blue Texas is something that Democrats have been salivating over for a decade. And remember, Beto O'Rourke came closer than a lot of people really expected, even with the tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars from the left coast of New York for his campaign in 2018. He came within 2.6% of beating Ted Cruz for Senate. That race led his supporters, being as close as he was, supporters to immediately wanting him to jump in for the presidency because they thought that, well, he can do it. He looks good, according to them. And sitting next to his apparently very wealthy wife this week, he jumped into the race. 2.6%. Think about this for a minute. Red Texas is moving purple. You've got Stacey Abrams in Georgia almost winning that state, and you've got red Georgia now moving purple. These are the anointed stars the Democrats want to hoist upon the American public over the next 2 years, and you're going to see a lot of them. In fact, if I was a political strategist, I would want Stacey Abrams on my race, especially if I was Beto, a white guy, or Old Man Biden, a white guy, or Old Socialist Bernie, a white guy, or any other white guy who's running. Because let's face it, the Democratic Party is the party whose primary concern, forget about anything other than identity politics, race and gender. Stacey Abrams will be on the top of my list. She is a she. She's a black woman. She is a socialist. Trifecta. So, of course, that lane for president is already occupied for the nomination process with Kamala Harris. Again, I believe she will be in the top 2 or 3 for nominating for the Democratic Party for president. Because, again, it's about identity, baby. But the media's treatment of Beto is nothing to sneeze at. Right now, here's their golden child. And as they did with Obama, slobbering love affair, thanks Bernie Goldberg, back in 2007, they're going to be doing the same thing because they will choose who your pick will be. And I'll give you another example of how the media is controlling this. Media Matters, David Brock's group that spends its time and donations ensuring that the very few conservatives that are in mainstream media are going to be taken down because of the 15 biggest news channels. We can't have one that doesn't abide by our talking points. Fox News thinks for themselves. We must have them removed. So they do this by setting up boycotts and having their minions call the stations to threaten advertisers. The latest is Tucker Carlson, who I'm sure you saw in the news this week, apparently made some off-color remarks back in the early 2000s on some show nobody's ever heard of before, Bubba the Love Sponge or something like this, while he was working at MSNBC. Now, listen, I don't agree with everything Tucker Carlson says. I like him. I think he is upfront about his opinions, and he adds to the national dialogue. But now he's targeted by Media Matters, who want nothing less to annihilate him. They want him removed from air. And once they have him removed from air, they will go after every Fox News host until there is no more Fox News, which will serve the left just fine. No other viewpoints necessary in the national dialogue. We are to be drones, like so many on the left, spouting Trump derangement, identity politics, and global warming and borderless countries. And until then, you are the enemy. And if you are someone who gets a lot of eyeballs, they will stop at nothing to take you out. Meanwhile, the guy who's running the scam over at Media Matters, Angelo Caruso, is someone you should check out. He's got his own skeletons, including transphobic and anti-Semitic remarks. Now, listen, as National Review's David French, I think he puts it best, okay? He says, and I'm quoting, Our nation cannot maintain its culture of free speech if we continue to reward those who seek to destroy careers rather than rebut ideas. And when you reward a Media Matters search and destroy fishing expedition with calls for boycotts or reprisals, then you are doing your part to destroy debate. It's vengeful, it's cowardly, and it's exactly the online world that spiteful partisans want to build. So on one hand, our media is anointing our next president with puff pieces, glamour shots, and never mentioning normally career campaign killing arrests like Beto. And in the same, this media is underpinning these smear farms aimed at taking out anyone who isn't lockstep in the monolithic groupthink that we see on the left. So to talk about all this today and some other great issues, including the new Green Deal, the border debate, and little reported but highly explosive news that the FBI conducted a fake investigation during the 2016 presidential election of Hillary Clinton and her server. You may remember all this. It was apparently limited by Obama's Department of Justice. We have John Hinderaker joining us. So we'll be right back after the break. I'm Dave Sussman with Whiskey Politics and America's Voice News. Thanks for joining us. And Dave Sussman back with you at Whiskey Politics on America's Voice News. Thank you for being here and joining us to talk about all of this and rehash it and bring it all apart and put it back together again is our good friend John Hinderaker from the Center for the American Experiment and Powerline.com. First of all, John, great to see you again. We had a good time at CPAC. A little bit of retrospect for you. What did you think of CPAC, just as a quick overall for you?
You know, I was there really to promote my organization. I spent most of my time at our booth, meeting people, talking to people. When I wasn't doing that, I did a lot of interviews. So for me, I had kind of a skewed perspective. It wasn't so much about the speeches and the programs. It was about what I was up to. I think the thing that made the strongest impression on me, though, was President Trump's speech on Saturday morning. It was an unbelievable performance. It was 2 hours long plus. My guesstimate was that he had a script for a speech that was about an hour long, and then another hour and 5 minutes or so was just Trump riffing spontaneously, right. Which is what I think he's at his best. I thought it was an unbelievable performance. For one thing, just the sheer stamina of a guy willing and able to stand up and do that is impressive. And the other thing that keeps striking me about Donald Trump, his opponents, his enemies, never want to admit it. They always want to portray him as this dark, sinister guy, angry man, which is the opposite of the Donald Trump that you see if you actually watch him in action. And the thing that I came away admiring on Saturday of CPAC is how funny he is. He is very funny. Some of these riffs that he would go off on, there aren't many politicians that can keep an audience happy for 2 hours when that audience has been waiting, in most cases, for probably 4 hours for the speech to start. This is like Fidel Castro, right? Yeah. Only Fidel wasn't funny. Yeah. And I think that Trump's enemies do themselves a disservice when they refuse to understand and to acknowledge what his strengths really are.
Well, I think he reaches out and touches a lot of people from a personal standpoint. They feel that he is real. And by just a real quick non sequitur here for you, for folks that are locked into that room waiting to see the president or Vice President Pence the day before, you're locked in that room for 4 hours. You can't leave and go to the bathroom and come back again. So there are a lot of people that are doing the shifty dance,
Yes, and a lot of those people were standing too. They had standing room for that event. And the staffer that I had with me at CPAC and my daughter, who you met, Dave, yes. They stood for 4 hours waiting, and then they stood for 2 more hours through the speech. I'm too old for that, right? Yeah, but the fact that he could keep an audience enthusiastic for all that time, very impressive.
Yeah, it was quite amazing. Now, I want to get into a little bit of the news of the day with you as well, because you and I, we had a great opportunity to chat at CPAC, and in fact with Michael Ramirez, the artist as well. And we had a good time chatting. But some of the things that we talked about, sometimes we have to look at things through the lens of how the media reports things, not just what they are, but the perception, right? And I wanted to get your perspective on what is happening right now with this onslaught against any conservative media, or I would say the few conservative media outlets that are out there. And you've got this organization, and you wrote about it, Media Matters, started by Hillary Clinton. I believe David Brock is running the thing, where they have you know, a half a dozen folks that are continually out there trying to scour the interwebs, trying to find something that a conservative media person has said that could be used against them. And we just saw this with Tucker Carlson this week. Now, even if you don't watch Tucker Carlson's show, you know he's in the news, and he's supposed to be now expected to be contrite for some comments that he may have stated about 13 years ago on some shock jock show on MSNBC. Can you talk about this, but also from the perspective of whether or not somebody is required to now say sorry to keep their job for something like this?
Yeah, and of course, what Media Matters wants is for Tucker not to keep his job, because he's one of the most effective people in the media on the conservative side. This is one of the terrible things going on right now, Dave, as you know. I mean, this whole search and destroy effort that the left carries out against anybody who sticks his head up out of the foxhole on the conservative side. If you're effective enough, if you're important enough, they will go after you relentlessly with something or with nothing. You know, they may not actually have anything, and they'll go after you regardless. I mean, look at what happened to Brett Kavanaugh. They had nothing, and they fabricated this whole myth out of whole cloth. And Tucker's the latest intended sacrificial victim, and they won't be satisfied until they have driven all of conservative media out of existence. And I think what's really important, Dave, is for us on the right to stick together. You know, we can't play the game that the left plays and wants us to play, where if they dredge up some improvident comment that somebody made 10 or 15 years ago, or whatever it might be, some story, you know, from when a guy was in high school, you know, like Brett Kavanaugh. I mean, come on, give me a break. Ridiculous. And we need to call them out on that. It is ridiculous. And we need to stick together, and we need to support conservatives who come under this kind of unfair attack. Tucker Carlson is the most recent, but he won't be the last. Anybody they see as being effective, they will try to destroy.
And yet you have this hypocrisy, though, as well, which is really frustrating to me, because you see this, and you see one of the leaders of Media Matters. Apparently, he said some things with some epithets as well in his history, Jews and Japs and something else along the line. So why does he get to keep his job, but somebody like Tucker, who was just riffing on some shock talk radio show on MSNBC 13 years ago, is now being taken to task?
Because he's a liberal. That's all. There's no pretense of consistency. You have someone like Ilhan Omar going around saying terrible things that would bring down wrath on the head of any conservative who would say them. Of course, I don't think there are any conservatives who would say them, but speaking hypothetically. And she took some initial grief from Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. But look what happened after that. The blowback came not from the right, not from people who are critical of anti-Semitism. The blowback came from the left. And Nancy Pelosi had to walk it all back. And in the end, the forces that are tolerant of anti-Semitism in the Democratic Party won. And Nancy Pelosi had to come up with a milquetoast resolution that kind of condemned everything, you know, which means it didn't condemn anything that Ilhan Omar was perfectly happy to vote for. So it's a totally different standard on the left, and we don't have people on the right who are paid to search through. Can you imagine what a boring job that is? You know, somebody got paid to search through God knows how many hours of ancient archives of TV and radio appearances, listening and watching to Tucker Carlson, waiting for him to say something controversial. But that's what they do.
They have a couple of handfuls of people that are sitting in those rooms doing that. They're going through archives. And then when they find something, those same people, plus maybe 20 or 30 others that they've got on some mailing list, they force them to call up and say, we're going to boycott this advertiser or whatever it is. It's a thing. I mean, this is their MO. And they are effective. We have to admit it. I mean, a relatively small handful of people calling up to boycott advertisers does get shows kicked off the air.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
they stay with us.
Yeah, this whole boycott business is sinister. It's a one-way street. Nobody boycotts all the liberal stuff on television. You'd be boycotting 95% of the programming, you know. But we don't try to do that. The whole boycott thing is very, very sinister. And of course, part of this same story, Dave, is deplatforming. We see time after time after time conservative spokespeople, even totally respectable ones like Dennis Prager. I mean, my goodness, Dennis Prager is the most upright, intellectual, respectable guy who puts videos on YouTube, and they deplatform him, trying to drive him out. This kind of thing is happening all around us, and it's really sinister.
It is scary, and I want to talk a little bit more about that, plus a lot more. We've got John Hinderaker, Center for the American Experiment, and where can folks find that, John? AmericanExperiment.org. AmericanExperiment.org, and Powerline blog, a great place, and a couple of other articles I want to talk about with John right after the break. Dave Sussman here, Whiskey Politics. We'll be right back. And Dave Sussman back with you at Whiskey Politics, and we have John Hinderaker in the chair. We're chatting a lot about, well, we just talked about media, but also the Center for the American Experiment. John, you were just telling me that in the state of Minnesota, which is where your think tank is based, you guys just released a report on energy and comparing it, I guess, in some ways to this big news about the new Green Deal, and we've got a lot of politicians that are out there supporting that. And what you guys have done some math, I understand. Yeah. Can you share us a little bit about what you found?
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. We released this report on Tuesday. We had a big press conference where we're driving a lot of publicity behind it. And the starting point, I think, is just to point out that what we analyzed in this report is a relatively moderate proposal, not the Green New Deal, where they just throw in free health care. Oh, by the way, free health care for everyone, too, and welfare for everybody who doesn't feel like working, just sheer unicorns and fairy dust. We actually analyzed a relatively moderate proposal in one state, Minnesota, to go from a current mandate of 25% renewable, which means wind and solar, to 50% renewable, wind and solar. Now, if you ask the average guy in the street, he'll say, oh, yeah, that sounds like a good idea, because there is nothing but misinformation in the public sphere about this kind of proposal. And the people that propose this legislation, they don't go to the effort of figuring out, okay, how would you do that? What would utilities have to do by way of new construction, of new power generation sources? How logistically would you effectuate a mandate, a requirement to go to 50%, in this case, renewable energy? Well, our people figure that out, what you would have to do, what the utilities would have to do. And then the next question is, well, how much would that cost? What would it do to electricity rates? And then the final question is, if you did all that, had that impact on electricity costs, what would that do to the state's economy? And to just give you a few of the top line numbers, the report is 70 pages long with its appendices. And the thing that I'm proudest of about this report is that it is completely transparent. The assumptions, the data, the calculations are all set forth. So if somebody wants to take issue with it, great. Here are the numbers. If you disagree, tell us where. So what we found is that going to 50% renewable in one state would cost $80.2 billion. It would cost every household in Minnesota $1,200 a year into the indefinite future. It would raise the electricity rates by 40%. It would hit especially hard businesses that use a lot of electricity. Mining companies, the number one expense they have is the cost of electricity. Refineries, agriculture, farmers use a lot of electricity. Manufacturing companies use a lot of electricity. The prices of all of those goods would be driven up, and those companies would be made less competitive. Our economists used the IMPLAN software that is standard among economists for this purpose, and concluded that that doing this would lower Minnesota's state GDP, gross domestic product, by a little over $3 billion a year, and would wipe out about 20,000 jobs, permanent jobs. So this is an economic catastrophe. And if you step back and you say, why would we do that? Why would we even consider that? The answer is, well, we got to get down our CO2 emissions. Well, maybe, maybe not. That's a whole story in itself. But we didn't go there. We just used the formula that the Obama administration used. we calculated how much CO2 would actually be reduced, and we used the Obama administration's formula to calculate the impact that it would have on global temperatures. And the answer is it 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees? No. It is 0 degrees. It is 0.0006 of 1 degree. That is an amount that is too small to be measured by even the most sophisticated scientific equipment. So,
John, there's got to be an Animal House Dean Wormer meme there somewhere, right?
It's unbelievable that people talk about these things as if they made any sense whatsoever. If you talk about the Green New Deal, you talk about doing this to the whole country. You talk about not just going to 50%, but it's exponentially greater. It's actually technically impossible. But as you approach 100%, it's exponentially more.
And the math that they did, if you do on the entire country, you're talking about $250,000 per household.
It's absurd. It is absolutely.
I mean, it's insane.
It would basically wipe out America's wealth if you could do it. Fact is, you can't do it. But the effort would bankrupt every American family. I mean, the idea that Democratic presidential contenders, I think all of them, have at least in principle endorsed the Green New Deal.
Right, which was going to be my next question to you. Say you get a Kamala Harris up there on the dais. I think she's going to, personally, she's definitely a contender and definitely in the top 3 right now. She has stood firm behind this. What do you say to her? If you were Donald Trump in a debate, how do you approach this with her?
Well, one thing Donald Trump did in his CPAC speech that was very effective and very funny, he's talking about wind energy and the futility of wind energy. Yeah. He kind of goes into character.
Television.
Yeah, he kind of goes into character. He changes his voice a little bit and he says, dear, is the wind blowing? I want to watch television. And it's true. We learned that the hard way here in Minnesota. If you rely on wind energy, wind turbines only produce electricity 40% of the time. 60% of the time, you have to rely on something else. They're not producing energy. So if you think you're going to rely 100% on wind and solar, the lights are not going to go on when you flip the switch.
Yeah, and Minnesota isn't exactly known for its 365 days of sunshine every year either.
Solar energy is complete. Every solar panel in Minnesota right now under 3 feet of snow, okay? 0 solar energy, even during the day, let alone the night. You know what they do, Dave? If they're going to build 50 megawatts of wind, wind turbines, well, then they go off and they build 50 megawatts of natural gas plant. So when the wind isn't blowing and the wind turbines aren't generating electricity, well, then you run the natural gas plant. Every time the wind slows down, you speed up the natural gas plant. And so the question arises, well, in that case, what in the heck do we need the wind for?
So, okay,
Nothing.
you got it's amazing. So you got this report out here in the last couple of minutes before our final break. Do you have folks in Minnesota talking about this and folks across the aisle from you who are acknowledging that this is a disaster, or are they hiding it, pushing under the rug?
Well, not yet. We just released the report on Tuesday. We've been all over the radio. We've been doing television and beginning to get the word out. We'll see the kind of impact that it has. For now, I'm hoping that it will give ammunition to the sensible people in our legislature, and there are some. We have a Democratic House, Republican Senate, so that this proposal gets killed for the current legislative session, which goes basically until Memorial Day. If we can give enough ammunition to the sensible people in the legislature to say, hang on, wait a minute, this needs to be studied some more, and they don't actually rush it through the legislature, that'll be a victory. And then we're going to continue taking on this, bringing this message to millions of people across our state, because, Dave, we're flying in the face of propaganda here. If you do a poll, and we've done this, if you poll the man in the street on wind energy, he thinks it's a great idea, because nobody has ever explained to him why it isn't. Last comment about this, Dave. You know who will never explain to him why it's a terrible idea? The utility companies. Because one of the things that our study finds is that if they were to do this 50% renewable mandate, it would increase the utility companies' profits by $30 billion. That's what
Really?
$30 billion. So we have this unholy alliance of the utilities and the environmentalists and the Public Utilities Commission, and they are all just sailing along trying to...
Is it real quickly, is that through subsidies, or where does that money come from?
Because the way a regulated utility makes money is by getting capital investment into its rate base. They want to make huge capital investments in wind farms and solar installations and transmission lines, billions in transmission lines alone. And then they get a guaranteed return of that investment, and they get a guaranteed profit of 7.5% on that investment. Makes no difference whether those things actually produce electricity, makes no difference whether it was a good idea. If it's approved by the Public Utilities Commission and it goes into their rate base, they are guaranteed return of their capital with a 7.5%.
That's amazing.
Annual.
All right, let's continue more after the break. We're with John Hinderaker, and this is incredible. We'll be right back. Dave Sussman here, Whiskey Politics. And Dave Sussman back with you at Whiskey Politics on America's Voice News. And we are delighted to have John Hinderaker back with us. And John, also there's a couple of other issues that I'd love to talk with you about today. And that is, first of all, you wrote a piece about how the border emergency hasn't gone away. It's out of our news headlines right now because just the way the news cycle works, everything is just, you know, it's fleeting. It's 24 hours and we move on to something else. Trump today, I understand there were 59 senators that voted against his emergency action on the wall. Sounds like he plans on vetoing it. But why do you believe this emergency action hasn't gone away, yet it's gone away in the media? Yeah.
And really the point of my post, Dave, as you know, was to say, you know, right now illegal immigration is kind of out of the news. But that doesn't mean that the situation has gotten any better. It's still a crisis. It's still an emergency. And when we do read about the problem in the news, it's often in the context of some horrible crime. And one of these happened just the other day out in California. There's a woman, a 50-year-old woman, who's going about her business, and unbeknownst to her, she's being followed around her neighborhood by a 24-year-old illegal immigrant who follows her to her house, pushes his way into her house behind her, and stabs her and beats her to death. He's found rather easily. His DNA is found. He's found to be in possession of her cell phone. You know, it's a classic incompetent criminal. But, you know, unfortunately, his victim is dead. And it turns out that this guy has been deported before. He's got a long criminal history. ICE knew all about him. 9 times ICE served, I forget what they call it, the detainer notice, you know, asking they found out that he'd been arrested, and they served the notice on the local police, sheriff, local authorities, asking them to hold this guy until they can get there and investigate his immigration status, because they think he should be deported. They think he's the guy they deported before already. And 9 times the California authorities refused to comply with our immigration laws, the ones our Congress passed. And 9 times this guy was released back into the population. ICE was not able to get their hands on him, was not able to get him out of the country. And finally, after that long history, he commits this brutal and senseless murder. The guy never should have been here. He should have, you know, there's so many times, so many reasons why this guy should have been gone. And these politicians and voters who declare sanctuary cities, sanctuary counties, sanctuary states, they got blood on their hands. I mean, there are completely needless, vicious crimes that are being committed because of this whole sanctuary theory. And I really think these politicians need to be called out on it.
So why aren't the politicians, A, being called out on it, and B, why do we see such vacillation right now, especially with politicians on the right? Again, this most recent situation with the emergency action, you've got 9 or how many Republican senators were there that voted against this thing?
Yeah, there's 53 Republicans, so I suppose it was 47 plus 9 to get to 56. Yeah.
Right. And so you have a total. I mean, we were one shy of 60, which would have prevented, I guess, a veto, if that's the way that it works, right? I'm not too sure about that, actually.
Well, to override the veto, you need 2/3.
You need 2/3. Okay, so they're not at the 60. They're not at the 2/3, which would be 66. But there's 59 senators that voted against this thing, with the Republicans owning the Senate. So where is this vacillation on the right? I understand from the left. I understand what their MO is. They need immigrants to come in and fill the voting rolls. What's going on the right here, John?
Dave, I wish I could explain it. I don't get it. There's a lot of propaganda that's been marshaled behind illegal immigration. The whole thing about the separated families and the children in cages, I mean, the propaganda mill is just unbelievable. And I think a lot of Republicans are afraid of it. The other thing, Dave, and the whole sanctuary thing really shouldn't play into this. But I think as a practical matter, a lot of politicians and a lot of voters are not making fine distinctions, right? And I think one of the things going on is that you've got this category of Republican politicians who are primarily listening not to the voters, but to the Chamber of Commerce. There is a significant segment of the business community, it includes the Chamber, that is in favor of a very widespread immigration, legal or illegal, because it drives wages down. It supplements the supply of low-skilled labor, and it allows some industries to be competitive that wouldn't be competitive if you didn't have that expanded pool of unskilled labor. And I think, Paul Ryan, I think, is an example of a guy like this who should have known better, but I think was swayed by business interests into being an open borders Republican. And I think he's not alone. I think there are a number of Republicans who are in that category.
Okay. Well, it's frustrating. It's extremely frustrating to see, especially in border states. And I'm hoping that somebody's going to get a wake-up call here. I think Trump could win on immigration if he stuck to it. I think he probably would. The House would have been a lot closer if he didn't divert, maybe not. Maybe people look at immigration and they're uncomfortable with it. They're uncomfortable with the political manipulation of the news that you just talked about, the kids in the cages and the whole thing, even though Obama had that. Anyway, I want to get to another issue with you because I know you have to run. In powerlineblog.com, your partner, Scott Johnson, another great writer over there, he wrote a piece on Lisa Page and how the FBI conducted this whole fake investigation of the Hillary Clinton email problems that she had. And the fact is that, and there's more, Scott wrote about this, but it's now starting to come out from other outlets, and that is that the Obama department, the Justice Department, I should say, actually limited the scope of the investigation and stopped it in its tracks. You have James Comey, who talked about having to do an investigation, and he stood up there in front of the world with all of us with bated breath until he got to the word however. And that was a pivotal moment in that election. So what are you seeing right here? Is this news, this came out of the Republican investigation when they owned the House last year. For some reason, it's just been released right now. Does this become a story that has legs?
Well, I sure hope so, Dave. I mean, we have been living through what I think is the biggest political scandal in American history. And people the Democrats talk about, Russian meddling in the election. Well, I'm a heck of a lot more concerned about the FBI and the CIA meddling in the election. The Russians go out and buy a few crummy Facebook ads. So what? What we really saw, the real scandal, is the FBI and the CIA meddling in the election. That's kind of like Watergate, except it's real. It really happened this time, and we've never seen a scandal like this in our history. And yet, the press doggedly sticks to this narrative where the potential scandal is Russian collusion, and it's all about the Mueller investigation, and Adam Schiff gets all kinds of airtime and so forth. And there's a couple of things going on, Dave. One thing going on is that Mueller is winding down his investigation. He's laying people off. They're closing up shop, packing up briefcases. Very, very soon, he is going to be submitting his final report to Congress, and then some portion of it will be made public, and we'll see what comes out of that. But I think it's a foregone conclusion that the report, the only thing the report's going to say that anyone cares about. He can say all he wants about Paul Manafort and Michael Flynn, whatever. The only thing in that report that anybody cares about is it's going to have to acknowledge that they looked high and low for evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, and there wasn't any. The whole thing was a fraud. The whole thing was a hoax. The Steele dossier, which of course we all know was paid for by the Hillary Clinton campaign, was a pack of lies, a fraud. And so I think that's going to be pretty important. I think there are still people out there who don't follow the news closely, who in good faith believe that there's maybe something to this Russia narrative. And I think the Mueller report, it's going to be ending with a whimper, not a bang. And I think that's going to help Trump. I think we're going to see some positive results. Now, the other side of that coin is what we ought to be talking about is the real scandal. The real scandal of how the Obama Department of Justice, the Obama FBA, and the Obama CIA conspired, first of all, to make sure that Hillary Clinton would win the election, which they didn't really see much doubt about. But then when she lost, they conspired to try to destroy and hamstring the Trump administration before he could even get sworn in, and subsequently right up to this day. I don't think President Trump even today is in control of the Department of Justice. I think it's still the Obama Department of Justice. This is a huge scandal.
Yeah, it really is. And it goes to the definition of deep state. And you use the word ham, and I think that's a good way to me to bring this news story that just came out last night that's now starting to percolate through the rest of the media. It came from the Epoch Times, and it suggests that Nellie Orr, she sought out Fusion GPS, and John Brennan actually made her get a ham radio license so she could communicate with Steele. This thing was orchestrated from the highest levels during the Obama administration. You know, Brennan got Stephen Halper, a foreign spy, to seek out Trump's associates and somehow find a way to get them to intercept with Russian connections to set them up. This is now being reported. Yeah. And I doubt we're going to see this on ABC News tonight, but this is what is out there now.
It's unbelievable. You have to be Inspector Clouseau, you know, going around with your magnifying glass, your nose close to the ground in the wrong place, you know, not paying attention to the actual crime. That's what we see here. I mean, the basic facts are so blindingly obvious. Here's Nellie Orr. Right. Who works for Fusion GPS. She's working on the Trump investigation. Her husband, Bruce Orr, is like the #3 guy in the Department of Justice. I mean, it's unbelievable the way in which the Obama Department of Justice colluded and conspired to try to make sure that Hillary Clinton would win the election. And we have these texts exchanged between Strzok and Page. We only have, I think it's about 1/3 of them, if I remember correctly. I think we have about 10,000. We don't have the ones from their personal phones. We only have the ones from their FBI phones, if you can imagine. Can you imagine your illicit lover, right? 10,000 texts they exchanged on their FBI phones. The whole thing is completely bizarre.
When did they actually get any work done? 10,000 texts. But this whole cloak and dagger thing, John, I mean, obviously Trump knows about this. He revoked Brennan's security clearance. And, you know, we've had people on the show that know the inner workings of the Trump administration. And apparently he's sitting on a lot more of this information. And he's going to be, according to our sources, releasing this drip, drip, drip. But is it having an impact?
I hope so. Conservatives have been asking for a long time, why doesn't Trump just declassify some of this stuff or redact it and release it? Things like FISA applications. You know, right. He can get those things. And I hope you're right. I hope these rumors are correct, that he's got a bunch of stuff and he's now going to start dribbling it out so that it becomes news stories. One thing that's happening is that members of these congressional committees are starting to make public transcripts of testimony by people like Nellie Orr and others who testified, Lisa Page, who testified before those committees. Those things are now finally working their way into the public domain. And so my hope is that we see a 1-2 punch. And the first is the collapse of the Mueller investigation and the collusion theory. That's going to be history. And that's going to be a great opportunity for the real scandal now to start coming to the fore.
Does it come back to a timing issue? If you were Trump, would you want this released in spring of 2020 as opposed to spring of 2019?
Oh, I don't know. I wish he'd done it in the spring of 2018. We wouldn't have lost the House, maybe.
Agreed.
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay. All right. Well, it's interesting to see what's going to be happening with this. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of faith in the mainstream media to carry this information because, like I said, this is an article from the Epoch Times. How many people read the Epoch Times? So that's the issue with all of this. And that is, you know, they're going to be focusing on Maxine Waters' focus on Trump's tax returns. Meanwhile, you've got this massive scandal, this cloak and dagger, which is, you know, if this was the Democrats, there'd already be a Watergate movie made of this. I mean, it would be out there. So,
well, I guess my parting comment on this, Dave, is that somewhere in this story, crimes were committed. Now, we know that Andrew McCabe was fired from the FBI for lying to investigators, which is a crime. And so far, I don't believe he's been indicted, has he? Or am I forgetting?
No, I don't believe so. He's on a book tour. He's on a book tour. Anyway,
so
last few seconds here, John.
I'd like to see indictments.
Yeah, we're going to have to watch this very closely and look forward to having you back on again to discuss this again. Center for the American Experiment.org?
AmericanExperiment.org.
AmericanExperiment.org. And what is your Twitter handle?
What is it? I think it's just John Hinderaker.
John Hinderaker. John, thank you so much. I know you got to go, and greatly appreciate you taking the time. We'll have you on again real soon. And Dave Sussman here signing off. Whiskey Politics on America's Voice News. Cheers. We'll see you soon.